Hello. It's good to be back here talking to you out in the wild, but it definitely is a little more than I bargained for. For the last month, I've been really struggling to get my mind around the topic that I want to talk about today, and I've just been struggling to put the words down on paper and figure out what exactly it is that I want to say. And when that usually happens, that means it's probably time to go outside, go into the wild, record a walk and talk, and just get away from sort of the normal structure of what a video is. Just kind of let the juices flow and think through the conversation. But now that I do not live in the desert, the weather, while still just as predictable, is predictably more miserable. And so there's a lot more rain and inconvenient weather to film. But today, we had a break in that. So I figured I'd shoot my shot, take my chance. But that means there's mud everywhere. And so I've mostly avoided it. But I am taking my shot. And yeah, we'll see where these things go. But either way, we're up for an interesting recording situation. So let's get into it. Let's get into what I want to talk about today, which is this process and this relationship between consumption and creation. And for me, this has been something on my mind, particularly in the last 6 months or so, because I found myself in far more of a consumption cycle than I had in the last 5 or so years, and more than I particularly like to have. And it really got me thinking about, what is this process of consumption creation? How does it fit into our lives? And what ways do we manage that and find balance within it? And yeah, it's been interesting to think through, because there's a part of life where we are all in this process of consumption and creation in all of these multitudes of ways. We see it in the biological aspects of our life, where we're taking in oxygen, breathing out carbon. We've got blood flowing through our brains, our veins creating cells, and our brains, our veins and our brains, creating new body cells. And I think even as a woman, you think of this idea of creation. We have the ability to create a new life within ourselves. And it's so wild to think about that process from that bottom level, but it infests our world in a lot of different ways, including just the meals we create and put on our table, the work that we do within our jobs, and the products we create, the services we provide. And for myself, being an artist, I think a lot of it in terms of the art I put out into the world and what that says. And there's this interesting dynamic between the biological, where a lot of the consumption is and creation is benefiting ourselves. Now that obviously kind of gets expanded a little bit more when you bring in the reproductive cycle into it, bringing new life into the world. There's a lot more that's going in your body that is not just for the consumption of yourself and the creation of yourself, but for another thing. But in general, there's a lot of that you breathe the air in to consume for yourself, and the carbon you create is expelled for yourself. And this seems to be slightly different when you're looking at any of the other ways that we're creating in the world. Whether it's the meal you're putting on your table, very often you're not the only one consuming it, or at least there are times when you're not consuming it. And when you're working, you're creating a product that's not meant to be consumed by yourself, even if you do consume it. It's meant for something bigger. And with art, I think there's often times where you definitely want to create something that is not just shared between yourself, but for others to kind of express and share what you're seeing around the world and what you're bringing in and taking out. And there's this tricky balance and dance between the two, that there is this level of consumption required to produce any type of creation. Yet, I think, especially in Western worlds, that level has become kind of imbalanced. I mean, I'm American, so we're a very consumeristic culture, but I think there is happening also in other parts of the world where we are constantly being asked and courted to consume things, whether it's streaming services, YouTube, media, fast food, what have you, all of these things that they're trying to sell us to consume. And there's a lot of things that we're being asked to consume that do create value in our lives, and the consumption can be helpful. But I think it gets a little tricky when the bar of creation gets lower, the barriers of entry to creating things gets lower, and there are more and more people entering the marketplace to bring ideas that we get lost in this consumption cycle where we don't even know where to put our energy, our money, our attention. And I think it's particularly more difficult with this idea of globalization, where all of a sudden you're not only competing with the market in your local community, but you have all of these people from remote parts of the world and people from your backyard that you're able to access the things they create within 3 button clicks. And it just becomes such an overwhelming marketplace. And I think for myself, I want to talk about it more in this creation space of art. There's a lot of different ways you can take it, but I think as an artist for myself, that's been something I really struggled with. Because there are a lot of these detrimental factors that come to this expanded marketplace that makes it really hard to sit and create and put things out in the world anymore. The first being, there starts to be this psychological doomsday feeling where you see all of this really beautiful art, this very high value production, and there's that feeling that you can't ever compete, that you'll never be able to put your value into the world or get to that place, and it can be kind of overwhelming where you don't feel like you can actually, master the craft. Now there's also the other side where it can be very inspiring and push you to move to goals and get to those places. But it's that tricky balance where sometimes the psychology within ourselves fights against that instinct. I think the second part of that too is when you see all of these stories played out in the world, I think you start to lose your own creativity of what story can I tell, what can I offer to the space. There's already too much available, and so you kind of move more into a reliant consumption cycle of I'll just consume the things other people create and comment on the other things that people create instead of going out and trying to create for myself. And again, there's two it's obviously two-sided, but it's something that I've seen happen a lot as the consumption just goes way up. And then the last thing, I think, sorry, we've got a train coming. The last thing I think it does, it kind of gets into this complacency where we get stuck in these YouTube spirals or binge watching sessions where we start to get lethargic, and we would rather just sit and watch the thing that's being produced than go out and put the things out in ourselves. And it's more than just sort of laziness, but I think there is this overwhelming quality, especially for myself, where I found that the more that I watch what people put out in the world, the more I start to get cautious of what does that mean for the impact that it puts into, the spaces that I'm creating. And what is the value of creating good stories and having good spaces to do those things. And I don't know, I think recently it's been more debilitating than inspiring. And as a general rule, I'm a pretty proactive person. I'm not very much of a sit around and wait and watch everybody else do something, I like to be in the mix and throw myself into things. But that also comes with a lot of costs and a lot of energy. And there's something about the process that, how do I say it? There's something about the process within the state that I am now, which is not my strongest state I've ever been in, that makes me really hesitant to create, or I don't even think hesitant is the right word, but careful and almost overly cautious in what I'm doing to take a step out and create. And some of that does have to do with a lot of the criticism that comes with people who create and put themselves out in the world, and seems the overwhelming pressure to come strongly for or against something, or be part of a dynamic that to me can be limiting in the process of understanding what a good story is. And so as I battle with that, I also look to this idea of what I believe creation can do for us, which is unlock what we think and believe more powerfully than if we didn't put ourselves in that process before. And it can open ourselves up to understanding the world, but it also can open us up to unpacking the things that we see and how they manifest in a larger scale. And there's being in this place where I've been doing a lot of consuming. I recognize that the consumption of things does a similar reshaping and recreating of what I believe and how I look at things, or at least an untangling or a igniting of those things, or recognition of those things within myself. And there's a little bit of a issue. We won't take that power and not be intentional with it. And creation for me opens me up to the process of intentional thinking and of intentional processing than consumption ever does. Because I think it's a busy time right now with the trains. Everybody's trying to go home. There's something very intentional about taking the step out and to do something, and you have to think more intentionally and more critically about what you're doing. Whereas consumptions, it's easy for you to shut off your brain and let things seep into you and rewire you and change the way you think without even recognizing it. And I don't want to fall into that trap. I think that's my biggest fear of allowing the things that I take in shape me without recognizing it and without giving it space to ask the question, is that a good thing that it's shaping me that way? Is it helping me act more positively, more beautifully in the world? And I don't think those questions are easily answerable. I think I'm going to spend my whole life pondering them, going back and forth and trying to understand how to do those things well. But restarting this whole project is, I think, one of those ways I'm trying to combat that feeling that I'm getting too caught up in an unintentional consumption cycle. So I want to be able to say that I'm going to be consistent in tackling this process of the things that I'm creating and create more of a balance within the way that I consume. And balance itself is kind of a very tricky thing to talk about, because I think often you hear the word balance and you think of something like a weighted scale where one stone is equal to another and it creates this equal balance. Or and on a more extreme, it's like on a balance beam of like all of these crazy tricks that you're doing and finding a balance within that. And one seems more simple to take on than the other. But for me, when I look at balance, I think often about those sort of stone statues that people create, where it's usually by rivers or on hikes, where they stack these rocks in these tall towers, bigger rocks in the bottom, slowly moving to these smaller rocks, and they balance them in these unique positions that they wouldn't naturally be balanced in. And there's something about that shows us balance is not necessarily about equal distribution in a seemingly easily identifiable way, because it all depends on weight distribution and the shape and most rocks are not weighted and distributed equally and don't have these very cookie cutter shapes. And so there's something about balance that interests me there. But then there's also this idea of like walking. Every day we step up and we walk. We're doing a balancing act. And it doesn't really feel like it. Like, you don't think about it in that way most often. But it is. And depending on what's thrown at us, what we experience in the world, we have this natural intuition to change our bodies, to shift our weight, to help us stay balanced so we don't fall on our faces and create damage to our bodies. And I think there's a lot about like consumption and creation that often work in those ways. I think this cycle of increased consumption for myself has been sort of a balancing act where I've been thrown way off my axes. There's been a lot in my life that's changed, and a lot of it in a very good way, but there's sort of this natural tendency for myself to find that way to cope, to keep myself grounded and on my feet. Now, is that a healthy way to go about it? I don't know. It's probably a very individual in the process. And while I won't say it's completely unhealthy for me, it's getting to that place where it starts to feel like maybe I'm trying to counter-correct, which is why I've also taken the space to really continue creating here, even though I don't have a clear target of where I want to go with it. And so I feel like I've gone all over the place, but I think this is just sort of a reminder myself and kind of opening a conversation for you all to think more about consumption and how we can turn that into something that gives us life, that creates something beautiful. And I think there's something too about being willing to take the steps along the way even when you don't feel like you're fully ready for it, and be willing to take that slow and steady and give yourself grace in the process of all of it. I don't know how well you can hear me with the last train, but I think with that I'll leave it. I'm sorry if I was all over the place. It's still very hard for me to figure out what to really think about this topic, but hopefully this was somewhat helpful. And yeah, I'm hoping that it will start to give me a better sense of what I do want to say about this topic and how it interacts with the things I do here. So anyways, thanks for watching, and the next time you see me, I will be in a more structured environment. So have a good one.